Hello, everyone, and welcome to Keystone Masters Season 1, Episode 1. On this day, we have 3 very exciting Mythic Plus Dungeon races, which we're going to be live. We're going to bring you live commentary brought to you by Jack, Zyronic, and JB. And of course, this show is produced by Sierra, Dairy, and Shine, and Keystone Masters is not affiliated with Blizzard, and all time is donated. So, boys, this is an exciting day of races. We have 3 whole dungeons. All of these keys were done on the Teaming Volcanic week we had a couple of weeks ago. What is it about Teaming Volcanic that maybe makes you look forward to running some dungeons?
Teaming Volcanic isn't gross. I mean, some of the teaming packs are maybe a little gross, but Volcanic is as free of an affix as you get. So, and since it's tyrannical, you've got light and breezy trash. And teaming probably gives you a lot of it. So I expect some enormous pulls and then maybe long enough on the boss fights to actually talk through their mechanics.
All right. Is that ironic?
Yeah, pretty much that. Volcanic is just about the freest affix you can get in the game right now, and teaming only really affects a couple of the dungeons, making a few pulls pretty bad. And yeah, maybe we'll actually get to talk about some boss mechanics this time, which is pretty exciting. You're right.
And I'm getting run over.
And so yeah, we also, something to note about these teams today, is we have some exciting matchups. Our first series is going to be 2 Alliance teams facing off. And we haven't seen Alliance in dungeons in any sort of MDI or KSM setting for a long time. So, boys, we'll start with Zyro. What about Alliance is something really spicy in dungeons?
Well, the number one thing with Alliance, obviously, is that you have access to Shadow Meld, which is by far the most OP racial for dungeons. It's just a free reset. Gives everyone on your party essentially a feigned death. So if something goes poor, your entire party say, you know what, reset, let's try that again.
All right. And so as we're going to be pulling up now the team intro screen, we're going to notice something very exciting about these 2 teams. And we've got 2 healers on deck to talk about it. JB, what is something that you notice about the tanks on these teams? There's something that stands out?
Well, yeah, neither one of them is a Blood Decay or a Brewmaster, and that is exceptionally rare in the World of Warcraft. I have actually not played with a Prop Paladin at all this expansion, and after Shaq stopped being Vengeance, I haven't played with a Vengeance Demon Hunter either. So I'm going to guess that this is maybe a 1 in 20 type of tank situation that you'd see on live, like representation wise. And I think we'll all on stream be learning a little bit about tank classes today because people just don't see these on live.
And so, Jack, you've been doing a lot of keys on live with Sloot on his Prop Paladin. What are some of the strengths of having that Prop Paladin tank in your dungeons?
I'd say a lot of it is the wealth of cooldowns, the defensive cooldowns that they bring to it. So whenever you're making the largest, most aggressive pulls, as you're seeing that we're on a 13 right now, for example, you'll be able to make them incredibly aggressive pulls, be able to have massive damage reduction cooldowns or cheat death with Ardent Defender, as well as just having the Bubble Taunt if they like to run with that, to be able to just make a massive pull, have a little bit of breathing room as they're making as they're getting everything in all together. And of course, anything that's going to require kicks, Prop Paladin can just shut it down, no problem.
Okay, and so then it's ironic. We have some maybe non-standard team comps here. Misfits is running a double melee ranged, and Resurgence is running a double ranged melee comp. What about the DPS compositions maybe stands out to you on these squads?
I mean, there's not really too much crazy about that. We'd be more talking about how weird the DPS comps were if they were triple melee or triple ranged. I think right now having 1 melee, 1 ranged, and then 1 of either as your third DPS is pretty standard. Having 2 ranged DPS means your kicks are a little. You don't have that many kicks in your dungeon, especially without a Prop Paladin. Although Vengeance Demon Hunters do bring their Silent Sigil, they should have enough lockdown for these pulls, especially on a 13 on Tyrannical, to make sure they don't get too many casts going off in these packs.
All right, and so without much further ado, I will like to preface to everybody that, of course, all of these casters, that no one has seen this, so this is all coming at you with live commentary. It's an exciting adventure for all of us. Logs for all dungeons will be available after the show for people who want to see exactly what went down in these dungeons. And throw it away now to Jack and JB for bringing us commentary over this King's Rest. Let's get this started.
All right, starting up in King's Rest. You said going through on the 13, and as you mentioned before, you know, one of the teams not running with the Rogue, it'd be very interesting to see where they're going to be running with those Shadow Meld skips, and seeing if, you know, just bringing in the extra non-Rogue or something like that's going to be helping them out just a little bit more in completing this dungeon and going a little bit faster, because we always look at some of these dungeons as to how high we're able to push them, but when we're looking at just the straight-up head-to-head race, it's always going to be very exciting.
Yeah, and definitely no Rogue in here for one of the teams. You know, King's Rest is one of two dungeons where you literally have to engineer ways to skip mobs or you go over count. And speaking of skipping, this first pack here is one of the few places in the dungeon that I think there's a legitimate chance to skip mobs. So I'll be curious to see if either of these teams pull the big Guardians or just run past them.
We're seeing the Shroud Step going up on to the side of the Misfits here as Resurgent is clearing up any of the minions. It looks like they are ending up pulling away all these mobs. You're going to see the tank, for example, just pulling everything away as everyone else is going to be able to skip by, use their Shadow Melds to be able to get through. You are seeing the stun going out on Resurgent. He's really going to be able to recover from that quickly, get past them, and then drop a Shadow Meld to start up the RP, get all the trash down into Golden Serpent's room.
Okay, so both teams chose to skip. So this is a pretty standard start to the dungeon. And then wait for the RP here. And room's going to fill up with mobs. Now, one thing that not having horde racials for either team means is that you're going to have to come up with ways to deal with the minions Azul that pop out here. No arcane torrents.
Just to be able to have, you know, those quick purges. You are seeing a massive pull here coming outside of the Misfits. You're pulling everything, just about everything in the, getting everything in the line of sight. You're seeing Darkness going down. Essence Font coming up really quickly by Mist Meddler, so that he's going to be able to get that double proc out of his mastery when he starts pumping healing into the tank there. Really got to be pumping Felinator as best as he can. And that's where you're going to start seeing those massive pulls coming up on the side of the prop alley, as well as leaning on a lot of kicks from it to be able to completely shut down certain mobs. So from that point, you will have an insane amount of cooldowns in Bubble Taunt, Guardian of Ancient Kings, to be able to help stabilize him. You've seen the Bubble Taunt running off for him right now, as Mist is going to continue to start focusing him and pumping his, as much healing as possible into him. You're just seeing the repeated Vivify casts through his Soothing Mist. Huge hit coming out, as you are seeing the Shadow Bow Volley from the Nightborn Witch Doctors coming out there. So really good job to be able to recover from it. And these are the pulls we want to be able to see. Even though it is a lower dungeon, being able to see those hyper-aggressive pulls are just so cool.
Yeah, no, that's definitely the type of pull you see on the lower key, because you didn't have enough kicks to deal with the Shadow Bow volleys there, so they were coming out, and on higher keys, that would just be straight up lethal. So this is the kind of fun stuff that you can see on the lower dungeons where you can absorb some of those and still keep going. That's definitely not a pull you'd see on live.
Definitely not, and we ever see Resurgence, of course, finishing up the trash. They took a little bit more time to end up dealing with them. We are seeing on the side of Misfits that they're clearing out the last of those minions Azul as they're waiting for the boss RP to get started here.
And yeah, that's it's about as fast as you're going to do that room. So I think Misfits has a strong start to the dungeon here.
Yep, and on the side of Misfits pulling into the Golden Serpent, having to watch out for the Spit Golds that are going out onto one target at a time. When the debuff expires, it will drop that golden pool. And you'll have to wait for the Golden Serpent to call any of the golds off the ground. Spawning little ads will try to travel back to the boss. Imperative to make sure that none of them actually end up reaching the boss, as they will give him a damage buff and a substantial shield, which will take forever to be able to shoot through, even on 13.
And we had a recent nerf to this boss on live where the health of the ads was reduced significantly, making it at least a legitimate strategy to try to kill them if you need to, but still teams are going to try to just crowd control the ads and keep them away from the boss. And killing them, I think, only is a last-ditch type of thing.
I was actually curious to see if they would just mass entangle all the ads in together. There is some issues, for example, having to keep everything tightly jam-packed together since they're not having any kind of mass or like sigil chains like on the side of Resurgence. But instead they're just opting to have Cloverthorn, just killing any of them. Like I said, they don't have that much health, so it shouldn't be too bad for them to really deal with here. Next up, you are seeing, of course, that Sigil of Chains going off, so they are just grouping up all those goals together. And then you have, the mage on the side of Sadio for Resurgence to be able to start killing all. Pretty simple to be able to get away with, especially on a 13.
Yeah, I think if you have a mage on your team, you can just kind of drop Blizzard on the mobs, both as a slow and then just for damage. So killing them probably just is a DPS gain for the mage. But otherwise, a pretty straightforward boss fight. Just drop the golds, keep the mobs, or keep the ads away from the boss.
One actually does get really, really close there. Good that it didn't activate immediately and start going right into the boss right away. We're seeing it just getting dropped just under melee, so good by the tank on the side of Resurgence. Start stepping away, getting away from it very rapidly here. But Misfits does have the advantage, already starting up the RP event for the Four Kings room.
Now, King's Room is straight up RNG in this dungeon as far as which of the 4 packs spawn first. And for Misfits, we've got the Blade Storm pack. And the King does a Blade Storm that annoys all the melee. And the Queen does a mind control that needs to be dispelled. This is another spot where not having horde ratios can be an issue, but I know at least the Demon Hunter can purge those.
Yeah, so at least you'd be able to have something, although it is actually very interesting to be able to see, like, you're not saying, oh, everyone just has an Arcane Torrent, or at least you'll have one Arcane Torrent in the group or something like that to deal with. You just having to think of different ways the Alliance is going to end up dealing with a lot of the ratios, and it really makes you think. But when you're looking at it the flip side, team not having to run a rogue on the side of Resurgent, they are able to take advantage of that Shadow Meld and have quite a bit of an advantage in that.
Okay, so let's see, one team got the Blade Storm, one team got the King.
I do not have a target.
Mobs.
Always important to make sure they have a target. Usually you'll see out of the Queen, for example, being one of the more deadly of the mobs they have to deal with, because up until recently, a lot of the damage was just super heavy from her, and any of the slows which were recently nerfed, for example, especially because they scaled up in keys, you're almost rooted in the ground unless you had some kind of escape or grip or Warlock Portal to help push you out of there or something like that. So much easier to deal with now, and especially when we're on a lower key here.
And plenty of RP in this room. Kind of an awkward pause from casters as we're waiting for literally anything to happen from these packs to spawn. And we've got the again the Blade Storm pack, and
yeah, and on the side of the Misfits, they're taking care of the tri-pack with Guard Captain. Always have to be watching out for the Axe Barrage going out from that. But you're also seeing the Ring of Peace going out for the King Rahu to be able to interrupt his lightning AoE effect. So making sure you're waiting until after he begins the channel, and then immediately knocking it back, making it a lot easier to have all the melee DPS maximizing their uptime there. So at that point, Misfits just cleaning up the last of the King pack here, and they should be well on their way.
And it looks like both teams are moving through this room at about even pace. I don't know that either team's coming out of here substantially faster or slower than the other ones.
Well, that's
so far it's looking like we're gonna have a good race through here.
Yeah, well, that's the interesting thing when you're going through kind of these more checkpoint areas, these slower areas where you're kind of forced to slow and forced to be able to take things kind of piecemeal. You don't really have a lot of opportunities to start like pushing way ahead of somebody else here. You're kind of just sitting there and waiting for Bloodlust to be able to come back, or just big CDs before you make a massive pull in Kimba's room there. So at that point, you're kind of just having to slow down, but it'll be very interesting to see how large they'll be able to pull, if they're going to be dealing with any of the blobs in addition to the golems there. Outside of Resurgence, you're going to see everybody just start moving through. You're probably going to start seeing the Shadow Meld skip come down again, because while this mob does give a lot of percentage, it does take a very, very long time to kill. So you will see the rest of the group start moving through here. It might actually end up dragging it in.
Just pull it, yeah. Just pull it in.
It might actually be a little bit too easy just to be able to murder and take down, because they do have the purification constructs they can just take down as well very easily. Just AoE everything all at once. It only is a simple matter to be able to have your monk just roll over, grab any of the entombed targets, and then just go on from there. So yeah, looks like they're out just grabbing everything in together, and that'll give them a lot of opportunities to skip something later on.
Now, what you have to be careful with in this room is that you have the two constructs, one on either side of the room, and they have an entomb ability where they stuff one of the DPS into a tomb, and the tomb that they put them in is determined by which side of the room you're closest to. So I think typically the idea, if you're pulling it this way, is to be towards one side of the room or the other, or it's easy to get your group split up.
Yeah, at this point, because they have the double purification construct of the one on the bridge, they also have one in this room as is. They will have a lot of dot damage here for Miss Mendler to start dealing with. You're going to watch out for the lasers. Unfortunately, whenever you're pulling so many mobs in together and you're having to avoid any of the poisons on the ground, you just have to play super aggressively there to be able to complete it and go a lot faster than your opponent here, because both groups are well into the 380s. I believe both groups are well over 2K on Raider.io, so at that point, it's all about optimizing these pulls and being just faster than your opponent. All something that they'll be able to complete in time, no doubt. Just playing more aggressively and taking more risks than their opponents.
A blood contagion almost wiped out these underlings.
Now I think I see. So it looks like Resurgent left the construct. So it looks like they just went some blobs with the construct on the bridge.
Yeah, not as aggressive there.
Yeah, I think Misfits just went for the. Oh, they left one infested construct up. Okay, so I think Misfits pulls. Actually, these pulls may end up being about similar in speed, but certainly pulling the construct in. I think without the infested construct in there would have been an entire room pull for Misfits.
Yeah, they pretty much grabbed everything that they could, and on the side of Misfits, like you're looking ready to start pulling Makimba here. Always important to watch out for the burn corruption that you will start seeing periodically. The fire I-beams that will be targeting onto one player and setting fire to one part of the room for about a minute or two. So you are seeing the rest of the groups, just kind of stacking in this corner there. That way they'll be able to bait it out and away from any kind of pathways they have to watch out for. So they'll quickly be able to go into those little tombs on either side to be able to break out their allies whenever he casts a tomb.
Now taking him to one side of the room or the other is, I think, like typically we've tried to keep him in the middle of the room because you get the entomb on one of your DPS, and then you have to be able to send players to both sides of the room to cover potential to get either a left or right tomb. So I think typically I've seen him tank more towards the middle to make sure that you don't have to run too far in either direction. But maybe the Demon Hunter mobility here is...
Gives Demon Hunter mobility. You also have Transcend, for example, on the side of the Monk to be able to go to the near side, as well as like the Boomkin standing pretty far out at range that he'll be able to quickly go to the far side if need be. So you're right, it can actually make it so that if it's the far side, the Boomies break them out, and it's a really long travel time for whichever melee ended up getting captured there. So being able to have that little min-max can make a really substantial difference when you're looking at the DPS uptime they can have.
And you see here now the kind of travel speed that you have to, like the distance that you have to cover in this room can be not necessarily a huge deal, but in a race of this size, making sure that you min-max your travel time.
Min-maxing everything, really.
Right.
You can speak from experience whenever you had to go through pulls as many times as you did in higher level Keystones whenever you're practicing for BlizzCon or the MDI LAN of the previous year. How much you're trying to optimize and how much you're trying to push it, be able to get just a little bit better of a result.
Okay, so let's see how big Misfits got here. Now, this is the other opportunity for skips in King's Rest typically come in this hallway now on the way to the third boss. And since both teams skipped the constructs at the beginning of the dungeon, I think you're going to see clearing most of the bridge. So it'll come down to how they stack these pulls together. And on teaming this week, you'll see that you get these brutes here at the start, which makes this pull a bit spicier. You got to run in and out for that ground slam for the melee. And he can be knocked around, so you can disjoint it occasionally, but after a while you run out of ways to stop it, and you just got to stay light on your feet.
Yeah, you are seeing the quick dispels on the side of Miss Medler to be able to start removing a lot of those frost shocks that are going out by any of the hex priests there, or sorry, the witch doctors rather, to make sure that they're able to have everybody quickly getting out of the group. That way they're not having to waste any other kind of utility abilities or anything like freedom to be able to get out rapidly. So good job there by able to actually use like Ring of Peace or any of the other displacements like you mentioned when they had all their cooldowns up to maximize their uptime on the brute and the rest of the mobs, and then they were able to start running around from that point.
I think we saw Misfits pull ahead, get a substantial lead there with that pull in the second boss room. I think that was quite a bit quicker, and it looks like they're now about a pack ahead through King's Rest. And I don't know if there's going to be a lot of ways to make up time on this bridge. So,
especially when Resurgents just used their Bloodlust there to do the exact same pull that their opponents did. So, if anything, they need to be playing even more aggressive there, taking even more risks to be able to deal with. And even on the side of Misfits, they did end up paralyzing that Witch Doctor first and then pulling the Berserker in with the rest of the group. So having the Paladin to be able to quickly bop or bubble ton off any of those stacks made a tremendous difference, especially when he's looking at maximizing his damage uptime to be able to stay in for that ground crush from the Brute instead. So there's a little bit of extra min-max on that side. Really made quite a difference on the side of Misfits to be able to quickly and easily get through that pull faster than their opponents.
Beware.
Now this if there is anything about this room that Resurgent or about these pulls that might favor Resurgent, it's that the Brute makes it very annoying for melee, and having 2 casters might give a slight advantage in being able to just continue doing your DPS rotation without having to worry about that. But I suspect with the way that we're seeing Misfits pull this dungeon, we're going to see more big pulls, and I don't know that Resurgent is going to get an opportunity here to make up time based on pull size.
Yeah, and even without any kind of grips, you know, you really see like how quickly you can get these as in. This isn't going to be a problem at all for the Prop Pally here, as they're making a very aggressive pull. The double packs to be able to start getting everything down very rapidly here. That polymorph does last a very long time. You'd want to see just maybe the quickest spell out of on the side of Cloverthorn and make sure you're able to get the Rogue back into the fight there. Do see it go off, and then Misfits is just cleaning up this pack very rapidly here. And they have a huge amount of trash percentage at 98.1. And good old Pete, or PETA, helping out with the Shroud, and they're able to get around that Shroud and start working on the Council.
And so, just as a quick kind of note before the fight starts, it does look like they're going to go over count in this dungeon, which I think is probably just a result of it was probably easier to just pull some of the bigger packs and blow them up and try to get tricky with skipping them. And I think that's something you'll see in a lot of these non-fort dungeons. Is just it's easier to just blow it up than it is to try to skip it.
Definitely, and you're just seeing you have the Council of Tribes, you have Akalai, the Conqueror, who will be having this charge. You'll have to be having everyone stack up, have him run through other players before he hits his target, help reduce the damage out onto them. You will start seeing his Shattering Strike, which will be coming out very soon as well, which will put in the debuff onto the tank. It can be dodged or parried, but if they are not, then they have to make sure that the tank's going to kite around, because it does make him take a substantial amount of physical damage afterwards.
And this one's pretty much tank and spank, not a lot. And wow, we get back to the Resurgent pull here, and it's looking like we're starting to see a substantial distance between the two teams in terms of dungeon completed. So,
yeah, and the gap just continues to kind of widen with Resurgence just strengthening their lead, as Misfits is playing safer pulls, less aggressive pulls here, and just trying to be able to catch up and hoping that their opponents are going to be making some sort of critical mistake. You were seeing Misfits was, if I remember right, was just making the more aggressive play, or look at very aggressive plays early on, but it seemed like they kind of just slowed down and petered off, whereas Resurgence just continues to play aggressively from the very beginning of the dungeon throughout, and it's really been a huge success for them. This pull, since they're at that similar percentage, both teams have very similar routes. You start seeing them move on through, get the Shadow Meld off so they don't have to deal with that little bit of extra trash. And the Brutes, like we've seen so far, just take such a long time to be able to deal with.
And it's looking like Misfits is going to be essentially 2 of the 3 bosses ahead on this fight before Resurgent pulls the first. And given how much of this dungeon is left, I think that may be pretty close to over. There's a pretty substantial lead in King's Rest, where at this point basically you just have 1 boss left and 1 mini boss, and not a lot of ways to make up time on that other than blazing DPS.
Blazing DPS. At this point, you also have to look at how dangerous the Keystone is going to be for, and the risk that they're going to have to going into. There's not going to be much more risk that Resurgence is going to be able to take to be able to start slowing them down. They're just going to have Zul ahead of them. They're going to skip the Berserker and Brute pack once again, and then it's just going to be going on to the last boss in Dazar. So playing clean, making sure that they're playing it correctly is going to make a massive difference for just maintaining their lead, really. And that's one of the things with Keystones and running them quickly with the MDI, and now with Keystone Masters, it can be very snowbally. Once a team gains an advantage, once they start playing safely, it can be very difficult for another team to actually get back into the game.
And I think Kula was about the only boss in here that poses a legitimate threat to killing someone with the severing axe, and it looks like that is not going to be the case. So I think Misfits lead, barring some incredible throw, probably insurmountable.
I mean, here on the side of Resurgence, they're still working on Zanazal. We're having to watch out for these the Call of the Elements here, where the 4 totems are going to spawn. The general focus is always going to be on the Explosive Totem first, because that can easily wipe your group. And you have the Thundering Totem and the Earthwall Totem. By killing the Earthwall Totem first, you'll be able to take off the spammed shields onto the tank or onto the boss, so you'll actually be able to have your damage continuing. But then you'll have to look at the Thundering Totem, which can interrupt any of the spellcasters there. So usually you'll see people taking down the Earthwall second, and then moving on to the Thundering Totem third. That way they'll be able to continue with their spellcasters and not have to worry too much about getting locked out of any spell schools or anything like that. Aside of I think the team names got switched around. But okay, yeah, there it is. So Misfits is of course taking down Zool, and then Resurgence still trying to catch up here and taking down Zanazal here.
So yeah, see here, getting close to finishing Zool. And it's looking like Misfits will be starting Dazar before Resurgent finishes Council. And I don't know that there's going to be anything on the 13 that we'll see from Dazar that is likely to be lethal. I think there may have been some opportunities here to do the fight faster, one team to do it faster than the other based on how you group up the Raptors here, but I don't think we're in danger of seeing either team wipe. So unless we get a couple of really exciting disconnects from the Misfits team, I think this is probably much.
Yeah, Misfits has established a great lead so far. They're taking care of the Shadow of Zool very safely there. They didn't have to soak any of the Pools of Darkness whenever he was played, just because they were able to have they're just able to outrange it. Whenever they're in King's Rest, the Pools of Darkness can just be outranged. It's like a 20-25 yard range instead of on the regular encounter in Old Year, which had just that unlimited range where you're forced to have somebody soak. So just being able to move out, outrange it, and they have plenty of defensives to be able to cycle through, to be able to burn it down quickly here. And on Dazar, he will be spawning the 2 different Raptors. We'll have Raban, who acts pretty similarly to what we've already seen out of the other Raptors. He'll jump around and have his hunting strike that needs to be avoided. And then later on, Dazar will spawn Tazala, who will mount, and then of course Tazala will have his Fear Roar, which will deal a little bit of damage and fear everybody in the group, but will also soak up and absorb any other damage that Dazar takes while he lives.
And you see kind of the speed pushing strat here on Dazar from Misfits, which is to essentially ignore the Raptors until you get both of them out. And then once you get both of them out, then pull all 3 the enemies together and cleave them down, which is going to mean more damage taken from the group, leaving up the first Raptor, but allows you to get better use out of your cooldowns on the boss and do better cleave damage in the fight more quickly. So those are the kind of strats you like to see in a speedrunning setting, where you recognize that the things that you need to do on live servers to stay alive aren't necessary on these low bosses, that you just push these to make the fight go fastest rather than keep it the safest.
Yeah, making those greedy plays, those hyper-aggressive plays that would really be the end of you in hierarchy, being able to see what they can do there. I mean, you saw on the side of Resurgence, for example, where their Demon Hunter just run in and start pulling Zool right off the bat, tanking it with Blur to be able to just, as they were still waiting for their tank to be able to come back here. So really cool to be able to see, the extra defenses being popped, and how aggressively their team would actually end up playing, just to make sure they're able to start catching up a little bit, gain a little bit of ground here. But at this point, just a couple percent, 10% left on Dazar on the side of Misfits, as Resurgence is just now pulling Dazar here. So well in hand here, and Misfits has played just very aggressive, and they cut all the right corners that they needed to be able to clear out this dungeon very quickly here.
Yep. Now I think this was a tale of big pulls. It was I think Misfits the first pull in first boss room, the slime pull in the second boss room, and some of the bridge pulls they were aggressive enough that it was going to be hard for any team that wasn't pulling like that to stay with them.
And there we have a very exciting and close game 2. We really saw the power of those big pulls from Team Misfits pulling them ahead. It's ironic. What was Misfits doing to allow them to accomplish all those huge pulls and just inch forward and gain that lead throughout this race?
Well, honestly, there's not too much that that was, you know, not anything really particularly special that allowed them to do that. We already talked about how the mechanics, the affixes for the week were very, very easy for doing large trash pulls. There wasn't really anything too particularly difficult, other than maybe having to personal through the Shadow Bolt volleys on their large initial pull at the beginning of the dungeon. Having, like Jack was saying earlier, having a Prod Paladin with all of the personals available to him to live through that big pull is really important there. But just honestly, the trash in these dungeons, especially with the affixes, just made it particularly easy to do large pulls. And that was the case throughout the entire dungeon. Misfits was really good at putting two pulls together, specifically. And they did that. We saw them do that in the first boss room. We saw them do that in the second boss room. We saw them do that on the bridge between the second and third bosses as well. And they were very, very clean about all of their pulls. They didn't really have any major deaths throughout the entire dungeon. So they did a very good job.
And so, yeah, so JB, we saw this was like a flawless, deathless run. And what are some of the considerations that you might take stepping down from the higher runs? Like, what do you have to change in your mindset when you're pushing these fast lower keys as opposed to trying to push that world first 23?
Well, you know, I brought up the example of like Dazar, where on a live key on the final boss, you've got raptors that come out that do legitimate damage to the group, and they're annoying. And on a live key, a lot of times you would consider killing them in order to make sure you don't die. But on a lower key, you say to yourself, well, the damage that they do is no longer significant enough to be a worry about dying. So we instead decide to just eat the damage and use the opportunity to do more DPS. And I don't know that there's a lot of opportunities for that on the other bosses in this dungeon, but that is an example of where you have to rethink a fight and say, what are the priorities now? On live, it's staying alive, but on these lower keys, it's how can we sacrifice some safety in a way that can gain us more speed.
All right, so now, Jack, this is the one for you, I think. We have something very exciting for Keystone Masters in our next series. It is going to be, we had first two North American Alliance teams facing head-to-head. Our next series is going to be a North American Horde and a European Horde team facing off in Waycrest Manor. So let's take a look at these teams. And Jack, tell me what's it like, Zyro as well, the NAEU life. What's it like being in both worlds?
It was very cool to be able to see, some of the more conventional tanks, for example, coming out, like we were talking about, bringing in the Brewmaster, and we've seen Prot Warriors really scaling up in representation recently. So very cool to be able to see like an NAU type of gameplay, because usually we'd only be able to see those kind of things at the LAN event when they're bringing those kind of teams together, or you're just comparing, for example, like, oh, how did that team do on Raider IO with that level of dungeon? So being able to see the speed runs, I think, would be excellent for the entirety of the group, and just being able to see the Disc Priest as well, to be able to start coming in hot. Having that disc representation will always be very fun.
Yeah, so this is a really exciting match we have here. Polite Children has some MDI experience of the team. Jason, or ZQs, has competed in both of the MDIs, and he is, of course, accompanied by some of the, I believe, the highest rated Discipline Priest Raider IO in the world. Some incredible players on the Polite Children team, as well as on the Paint for Femme team. This is our both teams come into here with the same average Raider IO score, so they're pushing keys just as well on live. But we do have one quirk in Waycrest Manor to talk about. And as these keys were run on live, we do run into one hiccup, which is the problem of doors in Waycrest Manor. So, Zyronic, you maybe want to talk about the different doors in Waycrest Manor and how that affects your run.
Yeah, so at the beginning of your Waycrest Manor run, you have a choice between either top left, top right, or bottom right door being open. And most people know top left door is very easy. It gives you access to the first boss right away, and you can use your lust on the trio boss. Unfortunately, if you get bottom right or top right, you have to deal with some of the worst trash in the dungeon, as well as you just have more trash between you and the first boss, making lust usage kind of iffy. So if a team gets left door and another team gets right door, we could see some variance in pulls and maybe a slight time loss on the team that got the right.
That sounds like a good as cue as ever for me. Without a doubt, for that, I'll hand it off back to you, Zyronic and JB. Take it away into Waycrest Manor.
All right. JB heading into Waycrest Manor. We've got two very high-rated IO teams. I think Sours forgot to mention that Feast Me Daddy on the left side team, on the EU team, is actually Shelley from Method PogChamp as well. So we've got two high IO teams and two MDI teams.
Yep, there's a lot of combined speedrunning experience between these two teams. And I'd be remiss not to give a shout out to my boy Jason, CQ's right now. He was sort of the original Brewmaster. You see a lot of Brewmasters playing the game now, but Jason was doing it back in Legion when it wasn't very popular. So I'll be curious to see. I think Prot Warrior has the advantage in Waycrest in terms of raw speed. It does a lot of damage in here, and if the Warrior does not succumb to damage himself, I think it gives the Prot Warrior a speed advantage in here, but I do expect to see some particularly large pulls from Jason's team, as I know that he's capable of doing with the Brewmaster.
Right, and we do see a variance in the first pulls here as well. We see Faint Pain from him going right to the trio boss on the top left side, and unfortunately the team got the bottom right door, which is one of the worst things in the dungeon. However, they are shredding through all that trash. While we're at the trio, why don't we talk about the boss mechanics really quick?
Yeah, so we've got three sisters on trio. The first is Sister Selena, who has each sister has an aura that they place on the boss, or on the group, and Sister Selena is the first of the sisters, places a healing reduction aura. The second, I'm going to try to work through these quickly because we're moving through the bosses very quickly. Sure. The second is Sister Malady, who puts out an AoE. She puts an aura out that requires you to keep moving, or you take stacks to deal damage, and then she also places a debuff on the entire group simultaneously that, as it expires or is dispelled, does AoE damage to the group, so you want to make sure you stay spread out. And then the final boss, Sister Briar, has a damage reflection aura on the boss, where when you hit her, some of the group members take damage. Also puts out probably the most dangerous mechanic in the fight, which is the Jagged Nettles, which is an ability that deals damage and then needs to be healed back above 90% to get rid of it, or it continues ticking as a dot. Hurts quite a bit. Each of the bosses needs to be dropped to 50%. Before only one boss at a time takes damage based on which one has the iris, and the iris is then shifted each time one of the bosses hits 50%. So you move once through each boss, they pass the iris around, then you move once through each boss again, 50%. And in the time it took for me to explain that, I think the boss is now dead. So I hope you guys were playing or staying along with that one.
Yeah. Well, that's a pretty good explanation, honestly. Couldn't have done it better myself. Now, they do take care of it pretty quickly because they did commit their lust to that boss. On the side of Polite Children, led by our MDI champion, Jason, they're doing a huge pull here where they pull everything in the room outside of the two infested mobs that were there with the boss. And they are also committing their lust in this. You see the darkness go down as well. Just using all their cooldowns and pretty easily taking down all the trash. Now, of importance in this trash, there are two Banquet Stewards, which will silence the group if their cast gets off. But other than that, there's really not too much going out in this dungeon, especially on a 13 setting on Tyrannical. The trash really doesn't do much. You just kind of have to make sure to look out for the boss's tenderized casts here. Anything else we should look out here for, JB?
No, I mean, I think you saw that this is one of the big pull potentials in this dungeon, is to pull trash onto raw. And on the higher keys, that's one of those things we talked about, where on higher keys that becomes dangerous, but on these lower keys, that's the type of pull where since there's no super dangerous affixes for trash, and there's nothing, it's not fortified. A lot of that trash is just kind of filler trash in the dungeon, doesn't do anything super dangerous. So it's good trash to pull onto a boss and just cleave it down quickly, and you don't really have to worry about it getting out of hand. So definitely a good use of lust there out of Polite Children, and probably as good a way as you could use lust going bottom right.
Absolutely. After both of these groups dealing with the first boss pretty quickly, they're both going to be heading out towards the courtyard, so they're going to be dealing with the same specific packs of trash pretty much at the same time. We're noticing something you said earlier with the Prot Warrior having the slight advantage in the dungeon here. Part of the reason is that they have massive damage output, and you're seeing that in this pull here. He's almost keeping up with the DPS. And on top of that, they're just continuing to chain these large pulls together, even without Bloodlust, which is pretty impressive, honestly.
Yeah, I think you'll see Prot Warrior have a pretty strong presence in the next MDI, and perhaps in more of these Keystone. As more players get Prot Warriors leveled up and geared up and get familiar with them in these speedrunning dungeons. In the dungeons where Prot Warrior is comfortable, and those are dungeons where primarily you can mitigate all of the damage through block. So Prot Warriors struggle with any damage that's dot damage or magic damage that can't be blocked with their shield, but anything else that can be blocked with their shields, they are very tanky. can take a lot of abuse. And so in dungeons where you're not afraid of the warrior dying, there is no other tank that comes close to matching the warrior's DPS.
Right, Polite Children did finish off that first boss as well as all the trash in the room pretty clean. We see them doing a large pull with almost everything in the courtyard, it looks like.
Yes, I'll be curious to see how they handle the infested here.
Yeah, there's 4 infested mobs, as you can see by... Is it 4 or 3? Yeah, there's 4 infested mobs, as you can see by the infested icons they have over the health bars here. Looks like they're using Ring of Peace to keep everything outside of the... And then they're going to deal with the spawns as they come out there. I'm curious to see how they do with the other spawns, though, that spawn afterward.
Yeah, we got some... There's several things in Waycrest that need to be tracked, sort of, as you're doing these big pulls. One of them is the parasites that cast an infest, and the infest needs to be interrupted or it screws with your mob count. And so
we do see them actually going down, yeah. It's unfortunate.
Yeah.
While on Paper Fim side, they're dealing with a mini boss right before the second boss here. Something of note in this courtyard is that if you do move mobs on top of the fire, they do take an extra debuff of fire damage. Doesn't seem like they're using that right now, but it is something you can use for a little extra advantage.
And as we see the infested pulls here together, for anyone that's not aware, the infested mechanic is such that any mob standing next to another mob that's infested will heal up. But if there are multiple infested mobs together, they don't heal each other. So a common strategy of these pulls is to kill everything that's not infested and then drag all the remaining infested mobs together and kill them in a pack.
Sometimes it works like that, hopefully. Sometimes they'll just heal each other regardless. Yeah. Unfortunately, sometimes things don't work the way they're supposed to work.
Now, here is a boss that is actually a fantastic boss for a tank, because all the damage going out on the tank is stuff that the tank can block. So the Goliath here is notable for being a tank masher and does a ton of damage just naturally to the tank, but then also has a stacking buff that causes him to do more and more damage and needs to be reset by dragging him into these fires that you see around the room, which then triggers AoE damage on the group. But warriors are so good at mitigating damage. Now on a 13, I suspect all tanks are, but warriors especially are so good at mitigating this damage that I would be surprised to see them ever reset the boss here, and the warrior will just be able to take the beating the entire time.
Yeah, and because of that, there's really nothing going on for DPS. Yeah. You just kind of sit there and you DPS the boss the entire time. Nothing to do except for maybe swap to the ad. Try to get your boy out. I'm curious to see if we'll see that big pull again here, if they're going to go for a second time. Looks like they're doing a lot more of a cleaner pull with no infested mobs here this time, which is probably smart.
So it looks, without the infested mobs, this is a much saner looking pull. And certainly when you get down to the courtyard here, I think a lot of times when you're looking for the big play potential in Waycrest, the idea is to get out into the courtyard as fast as you can, because it gives you a lot more room to work with and better spots to LOS the mobs and not get trapped. You see here, for instance, with the Thorn Shapers, they're dropping these roots under the ground that knock you up and can be super annoying as ranged and difficult to... It can interrupt a lot of your cast, especially as a healer if you're trying to pump heals and you're getting knocked up repeatedly from the Thorn Shaper. It's a big deal. So when you get out into the courtyard, you have more room to sort of finesse the pull and kite around and give the tank more opportunity to make plays.
Unfortunately, it looks like they are losing a little bit of time here. They did have an infested mob get broken out of CC and move into the group a little bit. Jason did try to knock it back with his Ring of Peace, but unfortunately that ran out and it ran into the group and got a little bit of healing. It's kind of sad to see, like, these are huge pulls that all have very intricate mechanics, but because it's a tyrannical setting and it's not fortified, they kind of just bulldoze right through it, like there's nothing.
Well, and this is one thing, is that when you get into Waycrest, there's a bunch of mobs in every pull. Like, there's several different mob types and a lot of different pulls, and honestly, there's so many of them that even if we had, a 22 fortified, I'm not sure that we could get through all the relevant mechanics before they started dying. Now, let's see, this pull looks like it's going a little bit sideways here. This is exactly the type of pull where you see a prot warrior be able to do, even if you lose a DPS on a pull like this, the prot warrior does so much damage on his own that it may not matter.
I mean, he doesn't even have a healer right now. I'm more worried about the DPS with all the spit debuffs on them than I am the tank.
Yeah, now this is one of the most dangerous pulls because of these spits. They're random AoE damage, or not, well, they're random damage on the group. And you get these debuffs, and it's essentially completely RNG how many one person gets. So you may get an even spread of spits across the group, or you may get one person that gets 4 spits at the same time. makes it difficult as a healer to predict who's going to need healing. And it looks like we had a few deaths on that pull, but ultimately it's a tyrannical 13. So this is probably, you're probably safe to use your battle reses here, not worry about necessarily needing them later in the dungeon. I think by the time you're going to get to dangerous pulls later, you'll have another one up. So,
right, and we did see that happen. The rogue went down at the start of the pull, they committed their battle rest of that, and then the healer died, and the healer just ran back in. Fortunately enough, the group, they did get that spread spit debuff, like you said. I think if any of the 1 DPS got an extra spit debuff, they probably would have died, but because they were spread out pretty evenly and efficiently, nobody went down other than the healer. Now we see Polite Children also dealing with Soulbound Goliath. Once again, it's a pretty straightforward mechanic on a 13. The tank's probably not ever going to reset his stacks here, making for the same essentially patchwork fight where the DPS sometimes have to DPS a Soul Thumb. They should get through this with no problem.
Yep. And this is another fight where I think tanks, there are a few fights throughout an expansion where tanks will use the fight as sort of a measuring stick. And Soulbound Goliath is a good one. As you increase tank power, you'll start to see how much you can get away with in terms of letting him build stacks. And I think you'll see some flexing by tanks on this boss as we get further and further into this expansion. Some bragging rights about how many stacks you could take.
Definitely. We are seeing Pain for Fim do the exact same large pull. However, instead of dealing with the infested mob first, they opt to sap it and then knock it away so it doesn't get broken out. Now, that will need to be rooted out there as well afterwards, because the sap only lasts 1 minute, and they're probably going to be on the spot by fight for at least, they could also distract it as well, so I'm not too worried about that coming undone during the fight. Once again, once the trash here is dead, especially the Banquet Stewards, there's really no danger to the group. Once the danger of everyone getting silenced is gone, you kind of just DPS the boss now. We didn't actually talk about the mechanics for this boss, if you want to go over those real quick.
Yeah, so Raw has a few mechanics. The most obvious one is that he summons these wasting servants periodically throughout the fight, and if they end up walking into Raw, then he gains a damage buff that stacks, and even that isn't necessarily a huge deal because the rest of his mechanics are mostly avoidable. So even if you let a few of the wasting servants get into Raw, it's not necessarily the end of the world. Otherwise, you see here that he does a big conal splash, which he takes up a third of the room in front of him. You need to make sure that you move out of the way of that, and then he summons some swirlies on the ground you need to move out of. Mostly it's just a fight where you got to stay on your toes and make sure you're moving around.
As we do see Polite Children heading over to their third boss, which was the first boss for their team, the Heartsbane. They are pulling almost all the trash back onto the courtyard, giving them extra kiting room, which is a pretty interesting strat. You did see them also CC the one infested mob in the hallway that Pain for Fim didn't have to deal with because of this different route. So we did see these two different routes going out. What's the major difference going to be here for these teams with the double route at this point?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, lust timing is a big one. Being able to pop lust immediately on the triad boss, and then I think it makes for more natural lust timing. Now, I'm not sure about a 13. The pull, a lot of this. A lot of the discussion about routes in Waycrest has evolved from live keys, so it may be that it's not as big of a deal on a 13. But then the route that you get to start, the door you get to start also determines your route through the rest of the dungeon. And sometimes you have to go upstairs. There's a few doors throughout this dungeon that are affected by what your starting point is. And so, yeah, I don't want to spend too long talking about it, but it changes the way that you walk through the dungeon and your timings for cooldowns.
Sure. No, I'm actually kind of surprised. Pain for Fim didn't commit their lust to that large pull with Raw, which is a pretty effective use of cooldowns. We're going to see them shroud here and go down to the last two bosses as well as the trash packs down here because they do have their mob count. 50 mobs left and they're good to go. Yeah, There's really not too much left for them to do here other than just DPS the bosses down.
Yeah, I don't. Looks like we don't have an infested down here, so this mostly just burn everything. And this is another one of those pulls that can be kind of dangerous on live because of the damage that comes out. But on a 13 tyrannical, I think you just pull it all together and blow it up. And again, these are the types of pulls that you can, having the prot warrior makes a difference here. A lot of times you talk about the differences in classes, and those differences are academic. One class could theoretically be better here or there, but a warrior is just like fundamentally different than other tank classes in terms of type of damage put out. It is legitimately a 4th DPS class on big pulls. Now, single target damage is nothing incredible, but its AoE damage is legitimately that of another DPS class, and it enables you to do some pulls you may not be able to get away with any other tank, because you can just kill the mobs before they do anything.
Right. Now, as we see them go through this boss here, Lord and Lady Waycrest is a pretty simple tank and spank fight for the most part, where the tank will be tanking down Lord Waycrest and Lady will be casting Void Zones on the ground. Fortunately, we're going to watch them. We're going to watch Polite Children pull the Heartspan trio, which we discussed earlier. I think we'll get to see a little bit more of the fight this time, though. As you were saying.
Yeah. So we walked through the mechanics, and there were a few that didn't get discussed, which is that each of the sisters is also casting, periodic spells, but the only one you really need to worry about is the one that's empowered by the Iris at any given time. You want to make sure that you're interrupting that one. Theoretically, each of the sisters has an energy bar that fills up as the fight goes along. If the sister is not killed fast enough, she'll cast a dire ritual that does big AoE damage, explodes on the group, but on a 13, you'll never see that happen. I think now I finally got an opportunity to talk about all this.
All right, and we're seeing Paper Fim already in the last phase for Lord and Lady Waycrest. As you go throughout the fight, once you get Lord Waycrest down to 30%, Lady Waycrest will sacrifice a portion of her health to heal him back to full, also giving him a damage increased buff. She'll do this 3 times before coming down herself and casting an ability that the group needs to interrupt, a Racking Cord. And once you get to this point, you just DPS down Lord Waycrest. It looks like they're opting to DPS them down evenly just for even more efficiency's sake. But at this point, there's not really much going on in the fight. Just interrupt Lady, make sure your tank stays alive, which Fem is going to be doing just fine on that warrior tank.
And this is another one of the fights where the strategy changes on lower keys, because you typically want to kill Lord Waycrest because he's doing more damage, even though cleave would be attractive. You want to try to burn down Lord because he's doing a ton of damage to your tank. But here on a lower key, you just don't care. You just do the straight 2-target cleave. Don't worry about killing one before the other.
And we see them actually just pulling all 7 of the Gloom Horrors right into the Gorak Toll. Gorak Toll actually got very, very nerfed recently. It used to be that you could only knock back or otherwise displace the adds that spawn in this fight, but since they added the ability for you to stun them, people just kind of like to keep the adds alive on this fight now for single target increases.
Yeah, so this is another one of those crazy pulls that you would never see a group in their right mind do on a live key, because these Gloom Horrors jump around and do tons of DPS to the group, and they are a scary pack in their own right on the live key. But on a tyrannical 13, all that is more DPS for your group on the boss. So that's exactly the kind of pull you want to see in these speed runs, recognizing that the threat they pose on live is not nearly the same as it is on 13, and also taking advantage of the warrior DPS. A warrior's DPS on Gorak by itself wouldn't be a big deal, but you pull the rest of those mobs in, and now the warrior can just start doing the same DPS as the rest of the group. And so yeah, this is exactly the kind of pull you like to see out of a speed run, where you recognize that the things that are dangerous on live aren't dangerous on low keys.
Yeah, let's just pull them together. And they just keep it up nice and even. I'd love to see what the damage done to the slaver is here. That's a lot of extra pad damage. But Pain for Fim, taking it out, really clean run, lots of impressive pulls, Polite Children. Unfortunately, not able to find the algorithm to doing this dungeon properly. And yeah, pretty impressive.
I mean, we did have, Polite Children did have the wipe in the courtyard, or in Rawl's room, that obviously set them behind, and Pain for Fim didn't make any major mistakes. So that was probably going to be the dungeon by itself, regardless of how fast both teams were going. But like I said, I'm not surprised, both with the advantage conferred by upper left and with the DPS you're getting out of that Prot Warrior. The Pain for Fim, I think, had just kind of the theoretical advantage in this dungeon.
Yeah, that's the power of that Waycrest Manor algorithm, as we've been talking about. Not even the power of all of that MDI experience could overcome some of that RNG on live. But we're going to move on now very soon. We want to look at our teams for Siege of Boralus. We have something very exciting to look at. We do, of course, have some, I think, a fan favorite. These guys really just kind of come out of nowhere trying to start pushing. We have our gamer dads. I'd like to talk a little bit more about these two teams moving into this next match. We see the Brewmaster has really come into power this expansion. Jack, what is it like? What is the Brewmaster like doing dungeons with this expert?
Brewmaster for me is without a doubt my favorite healer. or my favorite tank to heal in Mythic. I'm sure it is for many other healers as well. Brewmaster is just incredibly tanky. They are able to just have such strong mitigation when they're making more aggressive pulls. Their mobility, their ability to disengage from melee range, to get out of combat, start kiting with mobs very quickly and easily. Having Iron Skin Brew just being the insane mitigation that it is. The self-heal potential through their healing orbs, or using traits like Boiling Brew, for example, to be able to really pump a huge amount of healing into themselves. It's just quite substantial. So in that vein, we were kind of in that last series, we were able to kind of compare like, oh, Prot Warrior damage is actually insane. It's so powerful. But on the other side, Brewmaster can also help you enable some more drawn out pulls, more aggressive pulls, because it does have such strong mitigation. So if you're not killing everything immediately, you're able to actually have these longer pulls that you'll be able to continue kiting if you actually need to, and do so very easily. And while you may not deal as much damage as like a Prot Warrior, for example, it can also allow your healer, for example, to be pumping out a lot more damage, rather than once your cooldowns start falling off from like the Prot Warrior perspective and your healer needs to start kind of spamming you, you're able to have that good mix of healer and tank DPS from the Brewmaster plus whatever healer that you're bringing.
And so we also see our first Holy Paladin of the series. JB, what is the Holy Paladin like this expansion compared to in Legion?
Well, coming into the expansion, there was I think quite a bit of hand-wringing from the Holy Paladin community, because clearly Holy Paladins took a step back from where they were in Legion, which was, God tier. They were perhaps as strong as a healing class had ever been in 5-man. They had an exceptionally deep, utility kit. They had great burst healing, which was really important in these high keys where damage can be really spiky, and they had really good damage. So they sort of covered all the bases, and they had an immunity, which was really important. Legion, a lot of those things are less important in BFA, and then Holy Paladins just got kind of nerfed. And the biggest part of that was that their Holy Shock got some of its base critical chance removed from it, which made it no longer a 100% crit rate when you used it, which a lot of Paladins relied on. Healing kit was put out Beacon of Virtue, crit the Holy Shock, throw out the fat Flash of Light, and you could just top the group off instantly and reliably. And that's no longer there. And so it makes the Paladin a lot more RNG with its healing, and a lot of its damage got removed. But it's still sort of the cooldown king in terms of throughput cooldowns. And I think you'll see as eye levels go up and Paladins are able to get their crit rate closer and closer to the cap, that you'll see more people move back to that class. It didn't really lose any of its utility. It's still got very good utility. Its throughput is still good. It's still got very bursty throughput, and its damage. I mean, you haven't seen a lot of Paladins playing, so I think people kind of sleep on that. But I'm sure you'll see a few Paladins in either Keystone Masters or in the MDI who pop wings, do 30,000 single target DPS, and the crowd will lose its mind. So it's excited to see. Paladins have taken a step back in terms of popularity, but I'm sure there's some people out there that are going to come in and
and so you mentioned the eye level. So something really magical about these keys, right, is that these keys were all done on live servers, and the eye level of these two teams is actually the closest in between two teams so far today throughout all of these series. We're going to be getting ready to roll into this next game. Jack, do you have the new link? Are you ready to go?
Oh, I am ready to go, my friend.
We're ready to go. Okay, and that's the cue, boys. Give it away to Zyronic and Jack as we take it into the Gamer Dads versus Disco Ninjas in Siege of Boralus. This will be a game to remember.
All right, Jack, you ready to do this, man? You ready to look at the Siege of Boralus?
Absolutely, my friend. It'd be very cool to be able to start seeing that these two teams going up against each other, both NA teams that have been spending quite a lot of time pushing on live keys. Some of them together, a lot of the other people in the group you'll be able to see kind of running with a lot of different groups out there, not having a super solid group all the time. So it'd be very interesting to start seeing how they're going to start comparing and just going into this overall. Oh, that face. Good to see, Moofsy.
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, also, Moosey's kind of bringing something you don't see too much nowadays, the Hunter, the Beast Mastery Hunter, which is it's kind of fallen out of favor a little bit. It's one of the best classes at doing DPS on the move in the game. Probably the best range class at doing DPS on the move, so interesting to see how they'll take advantage of that.
Well, it's definitely here, and as the team is going to be going, the difference in the routes, you were seeing them start stepping up and actually going through the alliance portion of the dungeon by jumping up onto top of some of the little barriers there, start going up above that level. That'll allow them to skip past some of this lower level trash that the gamer dad's going to be going into.
Right, and one of the interesting things about Siege of Boralus is that it's a very it's not on rails like the last two dungeons we have, or like King's Rest and Waycrest Manor. The mob count is very fleshed out. In Siege of Boralus, you can skip a lot of trash, you can pull different trash mobs, so it's very interesting to see these different pulls. This pull here is a huge pull. I took the first 3 pulls together and added them together, which can be pretty dangerous considering those marksmen do a lot of damage with their Molten Slugs, but it is a 13 tyrannical key, so they aren't going to be doing that much damage to the group. And you see they take them down at the end of the pull.
It's also a challenge to be able to start separating these mobs out from each other. So for example, I think the marksman's being able to actually keep the infested away from the other one to be able to deal with. We are seeing Trell going back and grabbing that last infested halberd to be able to get him back into the rest of the group. But really important to watch out for that slobber knocker. Don't want to be knocked off the ledge there. Let's go ninjas moving on into that first boss room with Sergeant Bainbridge here. And also going to be looking to have a very aggressive, well, they did complete a very aggressive pull, and now they're just wiping up the last remnants for the infested mobs here.
Yeah, we didn't see it on the main screen there, but it looks like they pulled almost every single non-infested mob, but whilst he's seeing the other 2, and they're just dealing with the 2 infested mobs at the end here, which will allow them to pull the boss rather quick and get their lust on cooldown. Kind of nice.
It's interesting as well, because this might actually be one of the last times this weekend and the following to be able to see infested in a competitive pushing environment as well, since we are going to have Season 2 coming up very soon. Being able to kind of compare how aggressive these pulls can be, and maybe see where the delay will come in. For example, with infested, our teams to be playing even more aggressively than we're seeing right now in these kind of level of dungeons. What more can they really be doing to min-max these dungeons as hard as they possibly can? So it's very exciting to be able to see.
Right, so looking at this first boss here, we've got Sergeant Bainbridge. 2 main mechanics to look out for on this boss. Every now and then he'll spawn both a marksman and a vanguard, which have the exact same mechanics as their trash. The marksman will cast Molten Slug on random players in the group, just doing various raid damage. And the vanguard will smack the tank and sometimes do a large frontal cone, which goes quite a long distance and does a lot of damage to whoever it hits. On top of that, the boss will target a random ranged player with Iron Gaze, and they'll need to run away from him and hopefully kite him through a bomb. If the boss hits a bomb, he'll gain about a 50% damage increased buff and be stunned for about 6 seconds. So really important to take care of those damage increased moments.
Especially when there's so much going on here. You're seeing the gamer dads making an incredibly aggressive pull here and looking like they're going through the wind tunnel as they do so here. So grabbing all of the mobs in together, popping lust, and actually having a substantial pull to start dealing with here. Going to be very important here on the side of the gamer dads to start making sure they're kiting out properly, shift getting it under those the orbs as quickly as you can. You are seeing him running quickly back into the boss whenever he had the torrent coming off, the Hangman's Deuce coming in, quickly blinking out. That way he'll be able to start running him into the bombs once again. You do have to kill the first round, or the first round of Vanguards and Marksmen are often killed because you will have another set that will spawn regardless of whether or not you kill the first or not. But if you drop the CCs onto the second set of mobs that come out, you will not have to deal with any more in the future, and you'll just have to deal with maintaining the CC. Really cool to see here on the side of Moofsies. What he's doing is he's actually hitting some of the gutters on that far away platform there. You will not get percent for the gutters if the Kultiran footmen kill them before you tag them. So he's running over and he's just tagging all of them. That way, once the footmen do end up killing them, they're going to get a little bit extra percentage. Really cool strat to be able to see, especially as you're trying to min-max probably around 5 to 7% trash through this dungeon, which a lot of times is made through tagging those gutters before they're killed off, and can really prevent you from having to pull actual mobs that'll be dealing a threat or just take up a lot of time for you. So great to see that by Moofsy on the side of Disco Ninjas.
Yeah, like you said, throughout the entire dungeon, there are tons of those tiny little pulls where there's the gutters and the other mobs, and as long as you hit the gutters before the other mob kills them, you'll get that free extra percentage. And doing that there in a pack, and on mobs that most people don't even know exist, is pretty impressive. That's good dungeon knowledge there. He's doing it here on. You can see him doing it here on the boat as well. This is another 2% of mob count that most people aren't probably.
And whenever you're making those routes and having that perfection, Siege of Boralus is one of those dungeons where you always kind of have to account for if you have those little mistakes, you know, what extra, if you make a mistake tagging the gutters or anything like that, the punishment for it is you have to pull an entire set of mobs. And usually when you get near the end of the dungeon, unless it can just eat up a lot of time, even if you are taking advantage of the spotter to start pulling everything in together. Especially as a healer, it can also be quite detrimental because you're sitting in combat for such a long amount of time and kind of draining away your mana. So if you're making these aggressive pulls on top of that, can be really inconvenient. So great job to start attacking those gutters and the importance of the trash percentage here as Disco Ninjas looks to be pulling ahead for the ski.
Yeah, I'm interested to see now, because we do see a very big difference in the mob count right now. Gamer Dads have about 10%, 15% more based on where they are in the dungeon at a given time. And they'll definitely be using that extra mob count to skip at some point later in the dungeon. It'll be really interesting to see where they take that advantage that they've accrued by doing all this extra trash.
I love to see the Ring of Peace going now and start bumping a lot of these extra mobs into the spotter's AoE. Damage you get out of the spotter is absolutely crazy here. We're seeing again, now that all those mobs have been tagged, they got a huge amount of percentage just from getting all of them tagged before they were killed off. Then you have to start worrying about the footmen and the nasty dots that they do that are greatly lowering your haste, greatly lowering the resources that you're able to generate for yourself. So very important to get those down. And I like seeing that Trell is pretty much taking them down on his own as the rest of his group is DPSing down the spotter. A lot of times you'll see in groups, people will just go after the footmen because it's easy AoE to start getting down quickly. But then they have to start wasting another 10, 15 seconds or something like that, killing the spot. It starts eating up more time. So great DPS focus there. Even if it's not going to be as substantial in their overall damage, it's the right damage that they need to be putting into the targets to make the run go quite a bit faster there. So really good to be able to see that. One of the little things that help the team start putting ahead.
Yeah, for sure. In a speedrunning environment on lower keys like this, it's tiny things like that that are going to eventually make the difference. You're just going to just pulling the second boss, Red Captain Lockwood here. This is a pretty simple two-phase fight where during this phase, not too much happens. You kind of just take damage and DPS the boss down. However, when the boss jumps up on the boat, he'll spawn 3 adds, which all have different mechanics, and you'll eventually have to DPS them down in order to, once again, spawn the boss and kill the fight.
Yeah, very interesting to see that they're hanging on to the spotters here. So they actually have 2 spotters that they're holding on to throughout this run. And at this point, it looks like they're just going to set themselves up for cheesing the spotters as much as they possibly can here. Overall, if you're leaving them up, it's not too terribly deadly to really deal with here. All you have to be doing is just watching your feet and moving around periodically, which is no different than a lot of the mechanics that you'll see in this fight when the cannons are going out, like in that second phase, like you mentioned. So overall, the threat to the group is not too terribly high. And all they have to make sure that they're doing is being able to, keep watch their feet as they're going out through this. And the benefit is to be able to continue cleaving them down. There'll be another spotter that they can get in the future, but also the more aggressive pull that they're going to be making after this boss. They will be able to kill a ton of those mobs with the spotters very.
It did look like Moose wanted to do something with those commanders there, although I'm not sure why he would have wanted to pull them during the boss. Maybe he wanted to CC them or something. But of note, spotters don't do damage to commanders as far as I'm aware, so I'm not really sure why he'd want to.
As well.
Right, that'd be.
We're gonna have to get our detective hats on at Scooby, and we're gonna have to find out what that's gonna be. Maybe in a post-game interview.
Yeah, we'll take a look at that. We do see Gamer Dads are also on the second boss now, and they're a little bit behind, but we expected them to be because they pulled that extra pack at the start of the dungeon.
And back into the wind tunnel here with the Gamer Dads, as again, they're in that same situation. They are still dealing with the spotter. They still do have that spotter up, because whenever it's disengaging out, if you don't have any kind of snare onto the spotter, much like the boss, Dread Captain Lockwood, they will disengage and they will just continue kind of evading and getting away from the group there. So being able to, get it gripped in or get it pushed in to the rest of the group, start DPSing it down so you don't have to worry about it later on. But they are not holding on to the spotter unlike their opponents here. So they got it down quickly and they didn't waste any time.
Well, we're going to have to see if that spotter actually ends up making or breaking the dungeon, because this isn't a raging dungeon, this isn't a bolstering dungeon, so the spotter isn't going to be nearly as effective as it would be on those weeks. However, it still will add a bunch of damage to the We'll see if it is actually a large time increase for them.
I mean, you're seeing, on the side of the Disco Ninjas here, as they're still hanging on to those spotters as they're making those aggressive pulls. Moosey's is moving up into the group to be able to take it down. And usually this is the pull right after Lockwood. You're seeing in the bottom left, that's the kind of aggressive pull that you want to start pulling ahead in terms of trash percentage there. Because we are on teaming, you will have the double Ashbane commanders, which cannot be hit by injured by the cannons here. We are seeing the infested Bilge Rat Demolisher actually going into the group and putting a ton of healing out onto those commanders, wasting a considerable amount of time. So they are having the ad getting taunted out by Korzak, making sure he's able to keep it away from the group. But there's also the threat that the Ashman commanders are charging, and they're charging right back onto Korzak, back into the infested mob, and they have a lot more to deal with there, and it just takes up and eats up a lot more time. So really not what they want to be seeing. But they are going to actually get the commanders down pretty clean.
Yeah, but at the same time, that was a pretty impressive pull. They kept control of their mobs relatively well, minus a little bit of healing. Having a melee DPS tank it out there's a healer pull it out and tank it away from the group was quite a strong play. Gamer Dads are using their Shroud to get through a bunch of this trash and do a large pull here, actually.
Yeah, there's that Holy Pal utility, being able to face tank and plate armor, be able to take the brute of all that massive amount of damage here. And like you said, being able to have the huge pulls out of the Brewmaster Monk here is so strong. You are seeing them marking the Tempests for interrupts and kicks. Tempest is probably the most deadly of the mobs, even though it's maybe not the most annoying one. You'll see the Buccaneers, for example, with Banana Rampages or Frontals, but the Tempest has those nasty choking waters, which is a debuff that silences you and deals substantial dot damage. If that gets cast and put onto the healer, it is pretty much the end of that healer. So very good for them to be able to rotate kicks and get the interrupts on the other heal cast there. So very good plays there to be able to get that strong coordination. And they're also, like we said, not really running with the spotter from the previous runs. So you'll start seeing another massive pull here by the Gamer Dads. Maybe they're going to go upstairs and start taking advantage of the spotter, or with the power of the monk, they could just mitigate all that damage, start kiting when they actually need to, and put out a ton of self-healing here. It does look like the fear going off. They are going to start dying off. Maybe a little bit too aggressive for them.
That was really unfortunate. They were actually making up a bunch of time there. If you look at the side-by-side there, they were at the same point in the dungeon that the other team was. So pretty impressive how fast they were coming back, even without the spotters. I wonder if the spotters were actually kind of creating a liability in the group, making it so their melee couldn't get into DPS. I'm not sure. But before that wipe there, they had come back pretty substantially in the dungeon. It actually isn't even a full wipe, surprisingly. They're able to get back before everything reset.
Oh, it's actually excellent. Weebzilla was able to stay alive, the real hero that we need here. And then now you're actually in a pretty favorable position for the monk, where he's able to have, really straight open lanes that he'll be able to chi torpedo down, be able to create distance, create space between them whenever he needs to, and actually massive difference being able to have all of those mobs staying in combat, not resetting their health pools there, not having to DPS them from full HP. Once again, it's just absolutely massive. So I wouldn't say that they're terribly far off, but they really need to, basically pull the boss and get everything nuked down at once to be able to come back into this game and start catching up to the Disco Ninjas. Yeah, that was a pretty big hero play from Gabe there, like you were saying. You see Disco Ninjas actually doing a very large pull here with all of their spotters, and it looks like they're actually doing things pretty cleanly here. Yeah, often you'll see whenever you're running in more of a controlled environment or running on more high keys, you'll start seeing, the snipers being CC'd until they're just about to die. But when you're playing these more aggressive dungeons, you have to be able to run in there, and a huge amount of damage that Korzak had to be able to deal with. You are seeing a lot of healing, for example, going from Jazzy and Moofsy as they're using their own defensives, Darkness. You're seeing, the Spearmen heal, for example, to be able to be used still, as well, just coming off cooldown. So a lot of defensives that are able to take advantage of. Disco Ninjas is pulling the boss. Whenever you pull the third boss, Hadal Darkfathom, that will pull every bit of trash in his room. So they are able to reset the boss, but they pulled every bit of trash here. Very important to be able to get the spotter uptime as high as possible. Huge hits going out onto the tank here, so big time for cooldowns. You're seeing wings going up on the side of Korzak here, and be able to start taking as much healing as possible. But he does go down, actually stands in a double volcanic here. Battle res going out. They really need to be able to top him off. Zula's got no runic power. All of the mobs on him still. Double commanders that he's got to be able to deal with here. He's going to be able to create a little bit of space thanks to all of those ads getting killed by the spotter here, but that was really close.
Yeah, pretty solid DPS coordination there by the group. When you're using this spotter to AoE the trash down here, the only real mob that you should be DPSing down are the commanders, because they don't take damage from the spotter's AoE ground effect. So both those commanders being at around 25-30% once the rest of the pack was dead is pretty solid focus.
Absolutely, and it's one of the things, again, when we talked about, you don't really see on the damage meters. It may look like, oh my god, Outlaw Rogue having this much damage and huge damage on the group, but how much focus target damage are they doing into them? And being able to see those kind of results is exactly what you start needing to get going into those speed runs, trying to min-max the extra damage here. So Gamer Dad's just dealing with that last infested mob. They are pulling the boss to be able to reset him once again. That way they can then grab that last mob, kill off that infested before they end up pulling the boss and start working on towards third and fourth.
Yeah, at this point in the dungeon, both groups have all their mob count. Really only have to deal with the two last bosses, Hadal.
Beware.
Disco Ninjas have already pulled Hadal, so they do have a little bit of an advantage. And I can't actually see on the screen anywhere. Did they keep the spotter? Do they have it rooted in a corner somewhere? That's the important thing. Are they planning on using the spotter on the tentacles on the last boss?
I haven't seen any sighted artillery going down, so I don't believe that they actually would have it. But it might be that they could have CC'd it way off on the map. That way it wouldn't be casting onto any of them. But as I see so far, with all of the AoE that was going on, I wouldn't be surprised if some of the natural cleave damage just ended up killing it. Because with them having no way to actually heal that mob, unless they're dragging an infested on top of it, which didn't happen, the natural cleave that ends up happening will just end up destroying it.
Right. So, looking at Hadal, he just is pretty much Hadal is. It's about as close to Patrick as you get in this game. He does put out some periodic AoE damage on the group, but it isn't one-shot damage, especially on a 13. Nobody should be getting one shot here. Occasionally, he'll cast a wave from one side of the room, and you'll have to LOS it behind the pillar. And on top of that, you'll have to move out of small water void zones on the ground. But other than that, it's pretty much just a patchwork tank and spake fight. DPS as quickly as possible.
And this was another encounter that did end up getting nerfed a little bit from that breakwater, like we mentioned. It used to be quite substantial AoE damage. They brought that a little bit more in line. But then a big nerf a big scary buff to the boss for some DPSers was when the waves actually started scaling up with the difficulty of the dungeon. So for the first week of that happening, I'm sure you'll remember as well, maybe from own personal experience, ironic, of how many people wanted to test and see how much damage those waves really dealt. And then the resulting battle res that would follow.
Oh yeah, I'm aware. Soulstone was used on many people. That was quite fun. But it looks like they are dealing with the mechanic pretty simple. Nobody going down. Boss at 10% should go down here pretty quickly. And then they'll have to deal with the most dangerous mechanic in the entire... The water coming from Vitgoth. I can't wait until the... Can't wait till the MDI when somebody dies to this and Rich starts laughing.
That would be the laughter for the ages here. You're actually seeing both teams pulling pretty closely together here. Disco Ninjas has a, maybe 5-second advantage or something like that, pulling into the... But it is going to be a straight-up DPS race here between Disco Ninjas and the Gamer Dads. Very similar in item level, as Sours mentioned before the game started. Very cool to be able to see who's going to be able to pull this away and take it.
Yeah, essentially this is going to come down to which group is more efficient at their DPS. Essentially the way you phase this fight is by killing the gripping terrors as quickly as possible so that you can enable the cannon to shoot Vitgoth and take off a third of his health. However, at the same time, the group also has to deal with these constantly spawning demolishing terrors, which, if they aren't tanked, will do pretty large AoE damage to the group. And if you have more than one up at a time, you're in for a bad time. Disco Ninjas is just now getting their first gripping terror down, and that will enable the first cannon so they can get through this first phase pretty cleanly.
Yeah, both teams are almost neck and neck getting their gripping towers down together, and they both did end up that extra demolishing tentacle that they have to end up dealing with here. So getting very, very close in between both teams. Gamer Dad's pulling into the second island here. Trell is just taking care of the demolishing tentacle on his own, as the rest of the group is putting a lot of damage into the gripping. I've seen actually the Demon Hunter help. So usually what you'll see on this second platform is having at least one DPS to start helping out, killing the demolishing tentacle here. That way they'll be able to continue switching targets almost immediately. So the second that a new tentacle spawns, they're able to switch to it, and the old one is dead here. Always important to watch for those waters from Vitgoth that are periodically coming out. Those swirlies on the ground can deal quite a bit of damage and can be one-shot level at higher keystones. So very important that they're going to be watching out for those. At this point, they're just killing the first demolishing tentacle on the platform, and then everybody tunnel visioning down the gripping tentacle there. They do have two demolishers up at once, so very important to focus down at the lowest health one so that Trell can start moving in to that third one. Get that down before they can start moving on to the final platform, where it looks like both teams do not have lust available to them, so it's just going to be a straight up burn. It'll be interesting to see, which strategy they're going to end up going with, because they can have the option to start focusing on that first tentacle.
Yeah, we did see the road popping as evasion there to help the tank with the second tentacle that spawned there. Pretty smart play, heads up play from Morning. Now, what most groups will do, like you said, is they will actually try to go to the left here and not actually engage this demolishing terror. Gamer Dad's just straight up engaged it. They didn't care. They pulled it right away. Now, the thing about this Demolishing Terror is it has about 2.5 times the health of the normal Demolishing Terrors, so not focusing it down, not DPSing it down, could put you in a situation where you have multiple Demolishing Terrors at a time, especially when you're on this last boat, when you're on this last platform, and all you have to do is spawn the cannon. You really don't want that kind of situation. Now, they did already use their evasion. Yeah, go ahead.
They did end up using their evasion, but they went up into the full screen and just tunneled down that gripping tentacle. Because like you said, Demolishing had so much HP, so the +3 there on the side of the gamer to take what was an incredibly close race.
Yeah, they took that. They actually burned that gripping panel really fast. I didn't even see how fast it was dying. I was going to mention that it was possible for the other tank to either use their Holy Paladin or the Hunter Pet to tank, but it looked like it didn't even matter there. Pretty impressive run from them.
At that point, it didn't even matter, and they were able to just use their own defensives, deal with, put out any kind of stun onto that second Demolishing that ended up, and be able to take it. But for a lot of the dungeon, Disco Ninjas had quite a bit of a lead, and even after that near wipe on the side of GamerDads, Weebzilla being able to keep the polls alive, Maw being able to get back quickly and keep everybody alive, keep those polls going just a little bit longer. That was an incredible job of GamerDads start pulling it through and taking that victory.
Yeah, that was the closest Keystone Masters race we've seen to date. Incredible things. We saw, I think, a lot of impressive creativity out of the GamerDads. There was one pool that really stood out to me in particular that I want to talk a lot about with you, JB, which was the Shroud pool that Trell's team, the GamerDads, pulled into the little hut on the side. This pool was thought like the most creative use of Shroud I've seen a team use in so far this expansion. Like the power of this, the creativity. As we move into season 2 of Battle for Azeroth, do you think we might see more exciting pools like this in the near future?
Well, before we go into that pool, I want to kind of back up through the dungeon, and I think this pool is a good example of where we talk about sort of gimmicky, and I don't want to say this pool was gimmicky, but it felt like we had a case where the Disco Ninjas were ahead in the dungeon, and I think a lot of that was up until the second boss. Disco Ninjas were ahead in the dungeon, in large part because of that skip at the start where you can jump up over the top, and that was the type of creative use of game mechanics that you sometimes see in these dungeons that allowed them to skip a lot of really annoying trash at the start of a dungeon that has infested mobs in it. And you saw the GamerDads just plow into that and blow it up, but it had infested mobs. It took some time, whereas Disco Ninjas just went up over the top, skipped all of it, and I felt created like a good lead for themselves going into the dungeon through the use of sort of gimmicky or creative use of mechanics or what have you. And it felt like GamerDads were behind because they just went with the more traditional route. And then you saw Disco Ninjas, I think, sort of continue that trend of trying to get cute with the mechanics and then pull the 2 spotters at the beginning of the dungeon into the second boss and hold on to them. And I don't think those 2 spotters ended up doing anything for them. And I think slowed them down, in fact, when they got into the Banana Town part of the map. And then I think you saw the GamerDads end up catching back up with this big pull you're talking about, where I think GamerDads recognized that the value of spotters in this dungeon on a 13 is pretty minimal. I don't think they do a lot for you because this trash is going to die pretty quickly anyway on a non-fortified key. So GamerDads instead opt not to play around with the spotters and just shroud into this big pull, grab it all, blow it all up. And again, big shout out to Gabe for keeping the pull alive there at the end. It was looking pretty monka there at the looking like a full wipe, and they ended up salvaging it, and that was probably the play of the game. But certainly that type of pull, I think, where you just say, you know what, we don't need anything that's like, we don't need the spotters here. Those are important on high keys, but here we can just blow this stuff up. So let's just shroud into it. Let's grab it all. Let's pull it into the house. Let's go bang, bang, and let's move on. Let's not try to play around with the spotters. They're not going to do anything for us. So I think knowing when to sort of shift those gears, when to try to make really finesse plays with the spotters versus just saying, hey, let's pop cooldowns and blow everything up, it's an important ability to be able to make those calls in the middle of the map. And I think that was ultimately where the dungeon swung for GamerDads.
Yeah, bang, bang indeed. The GamerDads really pulled it out there in the end. You know, those Disco Ninjas, they had all those tricks up their sleeve. They jumped out of bounds a little bit at the start of the dungeon. They were attacking role-playing mobs for some kill count. But where would we be if we didn't have our dads? That's the story of Mythic Plus, right? So, as ironic, I want to talk a little bit more about some of the classes that we saw throughout these dungeons. We saw a lot of Boomkin representation and Demon Hunter representation, but some casters we saw a little bit less love of. What can some other casters, priests, and warlocks be looking to do to see themselves performing more and doing well in these Mythic Plus settings?
I think unfortunately right now the thing about warlocks and priests is that they don't really bring much utility to the dungeons as so much. Demo warlocks right now are probably one of the highest AoE classes in the game, but unfortunately they just don't have an interrupt. Instead of having an interrupt, their pet has a 45-second cooldown, 4-second single target stun, which doesn't really replace the 24-second. Priests, honestly, myself, I don't know too much about. I know that they can do some pretty good AoE burst damage, but they can't do it consistently throughout the entire dungeon, so nobody really even gives them a chance. I was gonna say I did see that Shelly was on the group, and I was kind of upset when I saw him playing as Demon Hunter, but I kind of should have known that. I wanted to see some Warlock gameplay. I was kind of excited for some Warlock gameplay, but unfortunately I didn't get to see it.
And we do, of course, have logs for all of these keys. If any aspiring players out there in the chat want to look over what all these teams were up to in all of these dungeons so that they can maybe change their gameplay. And then I want to throw over to Jack a little bit, talk about healers. We didn't see any holy priests or resto shamans in these keys. What are those holy priests and resto shamans out there who want to be pushing high Mythic Plus? Like, what do they have to do to really get themselves into the speed run and the high at the push scene?
To be quite frank, I think the neither spec is really suited well for higher level key pushing, and they have consistently just kind of been in a poor. It feels very weird when you're looking at like the toolkit, for example, for like Resto Shaman. You say, oh, it's got a kick, it's got an AoE stun, it's got a slow, you have Earth Elemental you're able to take advantage of. You have these cool tools. But in terms of the healing output that they're able to put together, it's not consistent enough, even with like Mastery, for example, right? The healing output onto the singular targets is just not that powerful compared to some of the other counterparts. Dealing damage, having Chain Lightning capped at 3 targets, for example, just not pumping out that much damage. The damage you can pump out, for example, if you're not having to do any healing whatsoever, is pretty solid overall. But that's not really Mythic Plus. You'll have these downtime moments where you're able to do a lot of damage, and then you'll have to kind of pull back and just start spamming healing. Disc Priest is able to kind of seamlessly do both at once whenever they need. Druid's able to kind of switch forms and pump out a lot of damage at one moment and then switch back and go back into healing, right? They're able to put Hots up, go back to dealing damage, and kind of jump back and forth pretty easily. Monk is able to do something kind of similar, or consistently weave in like the physical vulnerability debuff onto the mobs, which helps bring quite a bit of extra damage to the group, right? Paladin dropping Consecration or using Wings for damage or for healing whenever they need to, right? The other healers start having these tools that Holy Priest and Resto Shaman really just don't have to them. So you start seeing a lot of the Holy Priest mains, for example, switching into Disc. Our Shamans be able to have, a viable ult to be able to bring to the table here. But I think a lot of it comes down to the talent toolkit, right? But all the healer specializations are more than capable of doing the 10-15s. But when you start pushing higher levels, you just need a little bit more in the way of utility, like a tank external for most of the healers, for example, or to be able to have that kind of flow between dealing damage and healing, providing that extra value to the group along the way.
All right, and so sometimes you have to do what it takes to bang bang. Find your niche, excel at it. Most importantly, play the classes you're most comfortable on, and that's where you really see your performance come through. Whether you follow your heart or you re-roll to the next best thing. We'll throw it off to our boys to give some final thoughts. Zyronic, what do you have? Is there any final things we want to talk about? Look for teams to look forward to, perhaps in the next upcoming Keystone Masters and other dungeon shenanigans.
I didn't actually look at the teams we have in the next Keystone Masters, but I'm really impressed with the level of gameplay we saw today. Like, a lot of the teams were very, very polished. We didn't see any mistakes compared to the last episode we had about a month. So, really impressive gameplay. I'm looking forward to more of this.
JB?
Yeah, one of the things I really appreciate about the Keystone Masters format as opposed to the MDI is that in the Keystone Masters format, you don't get a lot of time to practice these keys. In the MDI, you've got teams that spend weeks doing the same key over and over and over and over. So you expect to see these pulls that are very coordinated, very a ballet. That's just all these things that have been rehearsed multiple times. Whereas with the Keystone Masters format, a lot of times you're running in here and you got the one shot. You haven't been able to just do this thing over and over and over. You can make very complicated plans, but at the same time, you got to be able to go in there and just do it. And so you see, I think it's a lot more exciting knowing that like we're seeing it for the first time, and this team may have been seeing this for the first time. Like they may have thought this through, but this may be the first time they've actually tried it in a live key. And so, it's kind of like, you can't necessarily assume that they've done this and they know that it's going to work. They may be running in and going, oh my God, I hope this works like we planned on it working. So I think it adds a lot more excitement in terms of being like, hey, I don't know that anyone in here knows how this is going to.
Yeah. And it's also cool because it kind of replicates what we see with live keys sometimes, where you continue to kind of scale up in difficulty with throughout the dungeons. And people say, okay, we can do what we did on the 20 for the 21 or something like that. But a lot of times it is, like you said, that kind of all-in format where you have to go in, try your best with the plan, but if something goes wrong, like Gamezilla, for example, being able to get out of combat or it's like get away from a lot of the mobs when he's still in combat, let the rest of his group come by, respawn, continue to take down the trash pack. Like everything was 50% there. If everything resets again, you have to start fresh and just takes so much longer. So having teams and seeing what teams can do to be able to come back from little mistakes to be able to complete the dungeon is always very cool to see, because even if it is a lower key, the incentive, the push to go as fast as possible, as aggressive as possible, can really make some big risks.
And with that, we will, of course, now announce the next Keystone Masters that you all can look forward to next Sunday, January 20th. Keystone Masters is back. Season 1, Episode 2. Will we see you guys there? Signing out.